Alright, you just let us know when.
It's on.
Okay. Alright, I'm being joined with Dr. Brian Abrams, a local doctor here in Flagler County. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Abrams.
My pleasure.
Okay, please tell us a little bit about your experience growing up with autism.
Okay, when I grew up with autism, nobody had a clue what autism was. I was born in 1958, which means I went to the younger grades in the early 60s, and I didn't even start high school till 1972. So basically my education was a typical 1960s education. And those were sort of dark days as far as education goes, in that the education community thought they knew more than they actually did. Now, thank God, they know a lot more about what's really true and what isn't true, but they tried a lot of things back in those days which didn't work. Autism was not on their radar. Nobody even had heard the word, because autism was first discovered in the 1940s, and it got put on the back burner in the early 1950s, and it wasn't rediscovered again till the early 80s. So when I went to school, it was technically after autism was discovered, but before anybody was really looking into it. So my odd behavior, as well as all of my brothers and when I say brothers, I mean fellow people with autism, they didn't know what to do with it. So they had put us in a separate diagnostic classification called minimal brain dysfunction. If you check the medical books now, that doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, okay.
Because they found out that was what doctors, and being a doctor I could say stuff like this, doctors have a habit of when they can't figure something out, they make something up so they don't sound dumb. And again, being a doctor, I'm on the inside, so I've looked at this from both sides. They didn't know what it was, so they made up the minimal brain dysfunction, which doesn't really exist, because 95 people that had that diagnosis have since been re-diagnosed as having autism. Because they didn't know what it was, they didn't know what to look for, they didn't know the signs and symptoms, all they knew is I wasn't fitting in and I wasn't progressing the way they expected. So they pretty much classified me as being low intelligence, which, you know, having a bachelor's in, you know, biochemical engineering, master's in computer science, doctorate in podiatric medicine, I think I kind of blew that myth out of the water. But they didn't know that then, because everything was locked up here. Because now with autism, they know there's no lack of intelligence up here, it's the ability to express it. And all they knew is I did horrible on tests, I couldn't talk to anyone, I had no way of showing anyone how intelligent I could be. They didn't see me when I went home from school taking little bits and pieces of broken electronics out of garbage cans and building workable stereos out of it. So my parents knew I was intelligent, and that's why my mother pushed and pushed. Initially, the school wanted to put me in an institution. My parents fought that tooth and nail. My parents wanted the school to give me speech therapy, something that in today's modern era, under the IEP system, is granted everybody that has the ESC classification. I did not have an ESC classification. I grew up mainstream education. So I didn't have an IEP, I had no protection. When my parents asked the school to give me speech therapy, the school said, well, they didn't want to waste a therapist's valuable time on someone who was too dumb to have anything to say. Wow. So my mom saved up, got me speech therapy on her own. It was only after junior high when I started to come out of my shell, because that was when they broke us up into different subjects, and I discovered the joy of science and math, which turned out to really pull me out of the slump because I was able to express myself
Right.
scientifically and mathematically, and I wound up from being too dumb to have anything to say in second grade to National Honor Society, top 5% of my high school class in 1976 when I graduated.
Wow.
And going to Rutgers College of Engineering.
That's amazing. It's such an amazing story to hear how nobody really knew what autism was, and you were able to grow up in that sort of system and still be so successful like you are today. Tell us a little bit about when you were first actually officially diagnosed with autism.
I wasn't officially diagnosed, believe it or not, until I was in my mid-40s. I had gone through, like I said, I went through high school, and I pulled myself out of my academic problems. I was still considered socially odd. Back then they used to call us people geeks or nerds. You know, they used to, picture us with the pocket protectors with the slide rules in them. A lot of those people, if you look back on them now, wound up being on the spectrum.
Wow.
But some of them were actually some of the most brilliant people around. It's just, they were nerds. Yesterday's nerds are today's, people with Asperger's syndrome. But I was considered a nerd. I had my nerd crowd, but that was okay because in high school, nerds find other nerds and they form their little nerd cliques. And during gym class, when everyone else was playing team sports, I would be in the weight room lifting weights with my friends. Most of them were looking back on the spectrum with me, and we would be doing calculus and physics problems on the blackboard between sets, because that's how we expressed ourselves.
Right.
And we were all pretty much considered outcasts by the rest of the school, but that was sort of okay because we had each other. Naturally, nerds weren't that popular with women, so people on the spectrum aren't noted for, dating a whole lot. Well, that being the case, it took me till I was in my 30s before I found Miss Right. I found Miss Right when I was 36. We got married at 37, and we had our first child when we were both in our around 42. Well, when he was 18 months, he developed problems, my son. So we took him to get checked out, and at that point, the same day he was diagnosed with autism is the same day I was diagnosed with autism. So I had all my degrees. I was a doctor, I was a computer scientist, engineer, the whole gamut, married, doing well financially, with a house, with a family, and suddenly here, boom, not only do you have an autistic son, but you're autistic. Or if you look at it from my wife's point of view, not only is your son autistic, but so's your husband.
Right.
So that was quite a shocker to the family that day.
Exactly. What was your initial reaction when you found out that you were diagnosed with autism and that your son was diagnosed? What kind of actions did you take?
Well, my initial reaction was one of relief, because I had been watching his behavior for 18 months leading up to the diagnosis. And like I said, before he was born, I thought my dark days were in back of me and that I was normal. Okay, as it turns out, I'm really not. I still have my quirks. I just learned how to cover them up when I'm out in public and blend in, if you say. I've mastered playing what we call the neurotypical game, which means we know how to act neurotypical. Neurotypical are people that don't have autism. We know how to blend in and interact with neurotypicals on their home turf because we learned. What most people do naturally, we have to learn when it comes to social interactions, because it doesn't come naturally to us. For me, okay, I thought the dark days were in back of me and that I was a normal guy. But watching Scott growing up, I realized, he's acting incredibly like the way I reacted when I was his age. So I was wondering, in the back of my mind, it was kind of gnawing at me, gnawing.